The year is 1940. The Atlantic Ocean has become a graveyard. Every day, German U-boats are tearing through Allied convoys like wolves through sheep. Merchant ships loaded with food, fuel, and ammunition are sinking faster than they can be replaced. Britain is starving. The Soviet Union is desperate for supplies. And America, though not yet in the war, watches anxiously as the lifeline connecting the democracies grows thinner by the week. Winston Churchill will later write that the only thing that truly frightened him during World War II was the U-boat peril, not the Blitz, not the threat of invasion, the submarines. Because here's the brutal truth. If Britain couldn't get supplies across the Atlantic, it would lose the war. Simple as that. And in 1940, the Allies are losing badly. German submarine commanders are calling this period the happy time. They're sinking ships with such ease that some U-boats return to port with brooms tied to their periscopes, the naval symbol of a clean sweep. British sailors have a different name for it. They call it the Atlantic meat grinder. The statistics are horrifying. In the first 4 months of 1,941 alone, U-boats sink over 500 Allied ships. That's more than 4 ships lost every single day. Thousands of sailors drown in the freezing Atlantic waters. Millions of tons of desperately needed cargo vanish beneath the waves. The Royal Navy is trying everything. They have destroyers equipped with depth charges, explosive devices designed to sink submarines. But there's a problem, a massive problem, and it's so simple that it seems almost stupid in hindsight. Depth charges don't work very well. Let me explain why. When a warship detects a submarine, it races toward the contact and drops depth charges over the side or launches them from the stern. These charges are set to explode at a specific depth, hopefully close enough to the submarine to crush its hull with the force of the explosion. Sounds straightforward, right? But here's the catch. By the time the depth charges sink to their detonation depth, the submarine has moved. U-boats are surprisingly maneuver, especially when they detect a destroyer bearing down on them. A skilled commander can dive deep, turn sharply, change speed, and be hundreds of feet away from where the destroyer thinks it is. Even worse, the destroyer loses sonar contact as it passes over the submarine. Think about it. The sonar is mounted on the front of the ship. When the ship is directly above the U-boat, the sonar can't track it anymore. It's like trying to see something directly beneath your feet while you're running. There's a blind spot, and it lasts just long enough for the submarine to escape. The result? Depth charges explode in empty water while the U-boat slips away into the dark ocean depths, ready to hunt again. British anti-submarine crews are getting desperate. They're dropping dozens, sometimes hundreds of depth charges to sink a single submarine. The expenditure of weapons is enormous. The success rate is abysmal. One British admiral calculates that it takes, on average, over 250 depth charges to sink one U-boat, 250 explosives for one kill. And even then, you're not sure if you actually sank it or if it just escaped. Meanwhile, German submarine production is accelerating. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, is building submarines faster than the British can sink them. He's developing wolf pack tactics, coordinating groups of U-boats to overwhelm convoy escorts. The noose around Britain's neck is tightening. Something has to change. Fast. In the Admiralty offices in London, naval officers are frantically searching for solutions. They're experimenting with new sonar technologies, better depth charges, more escort ships, anything that might tip the scales. But technology takes time to develop, and time is the one thing Britain doesn't have. Then, in late 1940, a relatively unknown lieutenant commander in the Royal Navy has an idea. His name is Stuart Neville, and he's been thinking about the depth charge problem from a completely different angle. Neville isn't a famous inventor. He's not a brilliant physicist or an engineering genius. He's just a naval officer who's frustrated by watching U-boats escape time after time. And his idea is so simple, so obvious in its elegance, that people will later wonder why nobody thought of it sooner. What if, Neville proposes, instead of dropping depth charges one at a time in a line behind the ship, we fire them all at once in a circular pattern around the submarine's last known position? Think about it. A submarine can turn left or right, go deeper or shallower, but it can only move so far in the few seconds after a destroyer passes overhead. If you could drop a ring of explosives around its probable location, the U-boat would have nowhere to go. No matter which direction it turned, it would be running toward an explosion. It's basically setting a trap, a circular kill zone. And the submarine, blind and desperate to escape, would swim right into it. Neville calls his invention the Hedgehog. The name comes from the device's appearance. The weapon system consists of 24 small mortars arranged in a rectangular frame on the ship's foredeck. When fired, these mortars launch 24 contact-fused projectiles in an oval pattern about 200 feet ahead of the ship. The projectiles arc through the air and splash into the water, creating a deadly circle roughly 120 feet in diameter. Here's the genius part. Unlike traditional depth charges that explode at a preset depth whether they hit anything or not, Hedgehog projectiles only explode on contact with a solid object, like a submarine hull. This creates two massive advantages. First, if the crew hears explosions, they know they've hit the target. With regular depth charges, you never really know if you've succeeded. The ocean is full of explosions, and submarines are good at playing dead. But with the Hedgehog, silence means you missed. An explosion means you've struck home. It's immediate feedback, no guessing required. Second, because the projectiles only explode on contact, they don't create the massive underwater disturbances that depth charges do. This means the destroyer's sonar remains functional. The crew can maintain contact with the submarine and, if necessary, fire again and again and again. And again, adjusting their aim each time until they achieve a hit. But here's where the story gets really interesting, because having a good idea and actually implementing it are two very different things. When Neville first proposes the Hedgehog concept in late 1940, the reaction from the Admiralty is lukewarm at best. Naval officers are conservative by nature. They've been using depth charges for decades. The system is proven, understood, and integrated into every aspect of anti-submarine warfare doctrine. Why would they want to completely redesign their tactics around an untested weapon from a relatively junior officer? Plus, there are legitimate concerns. The Hedgehog projectiles are much smaller than depth charges. Each one contains only 35 pounds of explosive, compared to the 300 pounds in a standard depth charge. Critics argue that even if you hit a submarine, the explosion might not be powerful enough to actually sink it. But Neville has done his homework. He points out that a contact explosion against a submarine's pressure hull is far more effective than a near miss from a larger charge. The explosive force doesn't dissipate through the water. It goes directly into the target, like a bullet compared to a hand grenade. 35 pounds of explosive detonating against thin steel plating is more than enough to rupture the hull and flood the submarine. The Admiralty reluctantly agrees to let him build a prototype. Development begins in early 1941 at the Admiralty's Weapons Research Facility. The engineering team faces immediate challenges. How do you fire 24 projectiles simultaneously? How do you ensure they land in the correct pattern? How do you make a contact fuse that's sensitive enough to detonate on impact but stable enough not to explode accidentally in rough seas? Remember, this is 1941. There are no computers, no sophisticated guidance systems. Everything has to be mechanical, reliable, and simple enough for exhausted sailors to operate in the middle of a freezing Atlantic storm while depth charges are exploding around them and German torpedoes are hunting their ship. The engineering team works around the clock. They test different projectile designs, experimenting with stabilizing fins to keep the weapons flying straight. They develop a spring-loaded contact fuse that's triggered by the impact of hitting a solid object but won't detonate if it just hits the water. They calculate the precise angles and charges needed for each mortar to ensure the projectiles land in the right pattern. By May 1941, they have a working prototype. It's mounted on HMS Westcott, a destroyer that's been pulled from convoy duty for testing. The crew is skeptical. They're experienced anti-submarine warriors, and they've seen plenty of wonder weapons that failed to live up to their promises. They call the strange contraption on their foredeck the Porcupine because of all the tubes sticking up. The first live fire test happens off the coast of Scotland. The crew aims at a practice target, a large floating drum. The officer in charge gives the order to fire. 24 mortars fire in rapid succession, a thunderous ripple of detonations. The projectiles arc through the air, trailing smoke, and splash into the water in an oval pattern around the target drum. The crew watches. They wait. Several seconds pass. Nothing happens. The projectiles have sunk without exploding, because of course the drum is floating on the surface. The Hedgehog projectiles pass right by it and sink into the mud at the bottom of the test range. One of the sailors mutters, "Brilliant, a weapon that doesn't work." But the test isn't a failure. It's a success. The projectiles landed exactly where they were supposed to land. The pattern is perfect. The weapon system functions. They just need a subsurface target to prove the contact fuses work. The Royal Navy doesn't have any spare submarines to use as target practice, obviously. So they get creative. They construct a large steel framework and suspend it underwater at submarine depth. It's not a perfect simulation, but it's close enough. The second test is scheduled for June 1941. HMS Westcott returns to the test range, locates the submerged steel target with its sonar, and positions itself for an attack run. The tension on the bridge is palpable. This is the moment that will determine whether months of work and precious resources have been wasted. The captain gives the order. The Hedgehog fires. The projectiles splash into the water. 3 seconds later, a massive explosion erupts from beneath the surface. Then another, and another. Multiple projectiles have struck the steel framework and detonated on contact. The test is a complete success. The crew of HMS Westcott erupts in cheers. The engineering team is ecstatic. They've done it. The Hedgehog works. But now comes an even bigger challenge, convincing the Royal Navy to actually use it. You have to understand the institutional inertia involved. The Royal Navy in 1941 has hundreds of destroyers and escort vessels. Every single one of them is equipped with depth charges. The crews are trained in depth charge tactics. The supply chains are set up to deliver depth charges. The maintenance procedures, the storage facilities, the safety protocols, everything is built around depth charges. Switching to a completely new weapon system means retraining thousands of sailors, modifying hundreds of ships, establishing new supply lines, and rewriting tactical doctrine. All while fighting a desperate battle for survival in the Atlantic. It's a massive undertaking, and there are still doubters. Senior officers argue that the small explosive charge in each Hedgehog projectile isn't powerful enough. They point out that even if the pattern is good, you still have to have accurate sonar data to know where to fire. They worry about reliability, about maintenance, about 100 different things that could go wrong. Neville and his team know they need real-world proof. They need to sink an actual U-boat with the Hedgehog, in combat conditions, to silence the critics once and for all. HMS Westcott gets its chance in December 1941. The destroyer is escorting a convoy off the coast of Ireland when sonar detects a submarine contact. The captain doesn't hesitate. He orders his ship toward the target, but instead of preparing depth charges, he positions the Westcott for a Hedgehog attack. The crew has practiced this dozens of times, but this is real. There's a German U-boat down there, probably lining up a torpedo shot at one of the merchant ships. If the Hedgehog fails, if it doesn't work, sailors will die, ships will sink. The sonar operator calls out the range. The captain makes minor adjustments to the ship's course, lining up the shot. The range closes. Closer, closer. Fire! The Hedgehog launches. 24 projectiles arc into the dark December waters. The crew holds its breath. 5 seconds pass. Nothing. 10 seconds. Still nothing. 15 seconds. Did they miss? Is the U-boat escaping? Then, suddenly, a single muffled explosion rolls across the water. One projectile has found its mark. One explosion doesn't sound like much, but for a submarine it's catastrophic. The projectile has punched through the pressure hull. Water is flooding in. The crew of the U-boat is desperately trying to blow ballast tanks, trying to surface, trying to survive. But the damage is too severe. The submarine begins an uncontrolled dive into the depths. Within minutes, it's crushed by water pressure. All hands are lost. On the surface, the crew of HMS Westcott watches as oil and debris bubble to the surface. They've done it. The first confirmed Hedgehog kill. The weapon works exactly as designed. News of the success spreads through the Royal Navy like wildfire. Within weeks, the Admiralty fast-tracks the Hedgehog program. Production ramps up dramatically. Destroyers and corvettes start getting the weapon installed as quickly as shipyards can modify them. But there's still resistance. Old habits die hard, especially in military organizations. Many captains continue to rely primarily on depth charges, using the Hedgehog only as a backup weapon. They trust what they know. They've trained for years with depth charges, and changing tactics in the middle of a war feels risky. This is where the statistics start to tell an incredible story. By mid-1942, enough ships have Hedgehogs installed that the Royal Navy can begin analysing combat effectiveness. And the numbers are stunning. Absolutely stunning. Ships equipped with Hedgehogs and trained to use them properly are sinking U-boats at a rate 5 times higher than ships using conventional depth charges. 5 times. That's not a marginal improvement. That's a revolution in anti-submarine warfare. Let me put this in perspective. Remember how I mentioned earlier that it took an average of 250 depth charges to sink one U-boat? With the Hedgehog, the average drops to fewer than 50 projectiles per kill. And because each Hedgehog attack uses 24 projectiles, that means most U-boats are being sunk with just 2 or 3 Hedgehog salvos. The kill ratio is even more impressive. In 1942, only about 5% of depth charge attacks result in a confirmed U-boat kill. But with the Hedgehog, the success rate jumps to nearly 25%. 1 out of every 4 Hedgehog attacks sinks a submarine. Why such a dramatic difference? It comes down to that brilliant simplicity I mentioned earlier. The circular pattern means the submarine has nowhere to hide. Traditional depth charge attacks give the U-boat a straight line of explosions to dodge. Good commanders can predict where the next charges will land and maneuver accordingly. But with the Hedgehog's circular kill zone, evasive maneuvers become impossible. Turn left, you hit a projectile. Turn right, same result. Go deeper, dive shallower, it doesn't matter. You're trapped in a 3-dimensional cage of death. The contact fuses are equally important. Because the projectiles only explode when they hit something, destroyers can maintain sonar contact throughout the entire attack. With depth charges, the massive explosions create a sonar blackout that lasts several minutes. The U-boat uses that time to escape. But Hedgehog attacks are quiet unless they score a hit, which means the attacking ship can immediately fire again if the first salvo misses. It becomes a deadly game of Marco Polo. The destroyer keeps pinging with sonar. The submarine tries to evade. The destroyer fires another Hedgehog salvo. The submarine dodges. The destroyer adjusts aim and fires again and again. Each salvo takes only minutes to prepare. The U-boat crew, trapped below the surface, running out of battery power, knowing that every second they delay surfacing is another chance for a Hedgehog projectile to find them. The psychological impact on U-boat crews is devastating. German submariners start calling the Hedgehog attacks the rain of death. They describe the sound of projectiles splashing into the water around them, knowing that just one hit will kill everyone aboard. The waiting is unbearable. Did the projectiles miss? Are they sinking toward us right now? Will the next sound we hear be the screech of metal as a warhead punches through the hull? U-boat morale begins to crack. Commanders who previously spent weeks at sea hunting convoys are now cutting their patrols short, citing mechanical problems or fuel concerns. Anything to get away from those British destroyers with their terrible new weapon. Admiral Dönitz notices the change. His carefully compiled statistics show a disturbing trend. U-boat losses are climbing while successful attacks on Allied shipping are declining. In his war diary, he writes about reports from commanders describing a new type of attack, something different from the traditional depth charge patterns. But German intelligence struggles to understand exactly what the British have developed. They know it's some kind of a head-throwing weapon because U-boat commanders report attacks coming from in front of destroyers, not from behind. But they don't understand the circular pattern, the contact fuses, or the tactical advantages these features provide. They try to develop countermeasures. But how do you evade a weapon you don't fully understand? By the summer of 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic reaches its turning point. This is when the Hedgehog really proves its worth on a strategic level. May 1943 becomes known as Black May among German submariners. In this single month, the Allies sink 41 U-boats. 41. That's more than one submarine lost every single day. The losses are so catastrophic that Dönitz temporarily withdraws his U-boats from the North Atlantic convoy routes. The Hedgehog isn't solely responsible for this victory. Allied success in the Battle of the Atlantic results from multiple factors: better radar, long-range aircraft, improved tactics, breaking German naval codes, and sheer numerical superiority in escort vessels. But the Hedgehog is a crucial piece of the puzzle. Consider this. In 1943, Hedgehog-equipped ships account for approximately 30% of all U-boat kills, despite representing only about 15% of the escort fleet. Ships with Hedgehogs are twice as effective as ships without them. Let me tell you about one particularly remarkable engagement that illustrates just how effective this weapon could be. In March 1943, the destroyer HMS Hesperus, commanded by Captain Donald Macintyre, is escorting a convoy when it detects U-191, a Type 9 submarine commanded by Kapitänleutnant Helmut Fien. The Hesperus has been fitted with a Hedgehog system, and Macintyre is one of the Royal Navy's most skilled anti-submarine commanders, already credited with sinking several U-boats. The engagement begins at dawn. Hesperus's sonar picks up a strong contact. Macintyre positions his ship carefully, waiting for the perfect firing solution. His crew has trained extensively with the Hedgehog. They know exactly what to do. The first Hedgehog salvo fires. 24 projectiles splash into the grey Atlantic waters. The crew waits, listening. Nothing. The salvo has missed, but the sonar contact remains clear. U-191 is trying to evade, diving deeper and turning hard to port. Macintyre adjusts his ship's position, compensating for the submarine's maneuvers. He fires again. Another 24 projectiles arc into the water. This time, multiple explosions erupt beneath the surface. Direct hits. The crew of the Hesperus can hear the death throes of the submarine through their sonar equipment, the screech of tearing metal, the implosion of compartments as the ocean crushes the wounded vessel. Within minutes, debris surfaces. Oil, wooden planks, pieces of clothing and bodies. U-191 is gone. All 51 crew members are dead. From first contact to confirmed kill, less than 20 minutes. Compare this to earlier in the war, when anti-submarine engagements often lasted hours, with destroyers dropping hundreds of depth charges and still losing contact with the target. The efficiency of the Hedgehog has another crucial strategic impact that often gets overlooked. It saves resources. This might sound cold and calculating, but in 1943, the Allies are fighting a global war on multiple fronts. Every ton of explosives, every sheet of steel, every factory hour matters. The resources saved by using Hedgehogs instead of depth charges can be redirected to other critical needs. A single depth charge requires approximately 300 pounds of high explosive plus a heavy steel casing. A Hedgehog projectile uses only 35 pounds of explosive in a much lighter shell. Do the math. A Hedgehog salvo of 24 projectiles uses about 840 pounds of explosive total. To achieve the same probability of kill with depth charges, you might need to drop 50 or more charges, consuming 15,000 pounds of explosive or more. That's a 95% reduction in explosive requirements per successful attack. Multiply that across hundreds of engagements, and you're talking about thousands of tons of high explosive that can instead be used in bombs for strategic bombing campaigns, shells for artillery, or charges for demolition teams. The steel savings are equally significant. Escort ships can carry more Hedgehog projectiles in less space than they can carry depth charges, meaning they can stay at sea longer between resupply. This increases the number of escorts available for convoy duty at any given time, which means better protection for merchant ships, which means more supplies reaching Britain. It's a cascading effect. One simple innovation creates advantages that ripple outward through the entire war effort. But let's return to the human side of this story, because that's what makes it truly compelling. The men who operated the Hedgehog systems were ordinary sailors, many of them barely out of their teens. They came from every corner of the British Empire and the Allied nations. Farm boys from Yorkshire, factory workers from Glasgow, fishermen from Newfoundland, merchant seamen from Norway who'd escaped the Nazi occupation. These weren't career military men for the most part. They were civilians in uniform, doing a dangerous job in some of the worst conditions imaginable. The North Atlantic in winter is hell, waves 40 feet high, temperatures well below freezing, spray that turns to ice on the deck, making every surface a skating rink, winds that can blow a man overboard in seconds. And they're doing this while hunting submarines that are simultaneously hunting them. Every convoy crossing is a deadly game of hide and seek, played for the highest possible stakes. The Hedgehog crews develop a particular kind of pride in their weapon. They call themselves Hedgehog boys, and develop an almost superstitious attachment to their systems. They paint names on their launchers, like fighter pilots naming their aircraft. They perform elaborate pre-battle rituals, checking and rechecking each mortar tube even though they've already been inspected multiple times. Because they know that when the moment comes, when the sonar operator calls out contact and the captain orders them to stations, their weapon has to work perfectly. There's no second chance. No do-overs. Either the Hedgehog fires correctly, or the U-boat might escape to sink another merchant ship tomorrow. Or worse, the U-boat might sink their destroyer. Let me tell you about able seaman Thomas Wilkinson, a 19-year-old Hedgehog operator aboard HMS Lagan in 1944. His story, recorded in his personal diary and later archived by the Imperial War Museum, gives us a window into what these engagements felt like from the deck of an escort ship. In February 1944, Lagan is escorting convoy on 224 from Britain to North America when sonar detects a submarine. Wilkinson describes running to his action station at the Hedgehog launcher, his hands already numb from the cold despite his gloves. The deck is coated in ice. One of his crewmates slips and nearly falls overboard, saved only by grabbing a railing at the last second. The captain brings the ship around, lining up the attack. Wilkinson and his team stand ready, hands on the firing mechanisms. Through the ship's intercom they can hear the sonar pings, faster and faster as the range closes. The submarine is right below them. Fire, Hedgehog. Wilkinson hits the firing button. The mortars roar. He watches the projectiles arc away through the grey dawn light, watches them splash into the choppy seas in that distinctive oval pattern. Then he waits, counting seconds in his head like he's been trained to do. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. An explosion, then another. Then several more in rapid succession. The sea erupts in a boiling cauldron of white water. The stern of the Lagan lifts slightly as the shock waves reach them. Through the intercom, the sonar operator's voice. Multiple contacts, metallic debris, large oil slick forming. They've killed it. They've sunk a U-boat. Wilkinson writes in his diary that night, "We got one today. Feel sick about it, to be honest. Those German lads died hard, crushed in the dark. But then I remember the merchant ships they sank, the convoys they attacked, the men they killed. This is war. This is what we're here for. Still feel sick, though. That moral complexity, that human dimension, is present in every engagement. These aren't video game kills or statistics on a chart. These are men killing other men, young sailors on both sides dying in the cold Atlantic, far from home. But here's something important to understand. The Hedgehog, by being so effective, actually saves lives on both sides in the long run. I know that sounds paradoxical, so let me explain. Every U-boat that the Hedgehog sinks quickly is a U-boat that doesn't spend hours being depth-charged. Traditional depth-charge attacks were prolonged, brutal affairs. A submarine caught in a depth-charged barrage might endure hours of explosions, the hull creaking and groaning, leaks springing up, men terrified out of their minds, before finally either escaping or being destroyed. The psychological torture of a sustained depth-charge attack is almost beyond description. Former U-boat survivors describe it as the worst experience of their lives, worse than anything else they endured during the war. The constant explosions, not knowing if the next one will crack your hull. The darkness, because you can't risk turning on lights that might drain the battery. The silence between attacks, straining to hear the propeller sounds of the destroyer above you, trying to guess where it will strike next. With the Hedgehog, the end comes quickly. If a projectile hits, the submarine is destroyed almost instantly. The crew doesn't suffer through hours of terror. It's brutal, yes, but it's mercifully quick. Continue when ready. Retria continuand for the Allied merchant sailors, the ones who aren't fighting at all but just trying to deliver cargo. The Hedgehog means fewer of them die in torpedo attacks. Because every U-boat sunk is dozens of merchant ships that won't be torpedoed, hundreds of civilian sailors who won't drown in burning oil slicks or freeze to death in lifeboats waiting for rescue that might never come. The mathematics of war are cold, but they're real. The Hedgehog tilts those mathematics decisively in favor of the Allies. By 1944, the weapon has been so successful that the United States Navy adopts it for their own escort vessels. American shipyards begin producing Hedgehogs under license, and U.S. Navy ships operating in both the Atlantic and Pacific theaters are equipped with the system. The Americans make some modifications. They develop a version called the Mousetrap that uses fewer projectiles but can be fitted to smaller vessels. They experiment with different firing patterns and projectile designs, but the core concept remains the same: a head, throwing weapons, contact fuses, circular kill pattern. The Royal Canadian Navy also embraces the Hedgehog enthusiastically. Canadian corvettes and frigates, which form a huge portion of the mid-Atlantic escort forces, prove particularly effective with the weapon. Ships like HMCS Street Laurent and HMCS Waskeshu rack up impressive kill records using Hedgehog attacks. There's an interesting tactical development that emerges as crews gain experience with the weapon. Commanders discover that the Hedgehog is most effective when used as part of a coordinated attack with multiple ships. Here's how it works. 2 or 3 escort vessels detect a submarine. Instead of all attacking at once, they coordinate their movements. One ship makes the initial Hedgehog attack, forcing the submarine to maneuver. The other ships, positioned strategically around the contact, track the submarine's evasive movements and prepare their own attacks. As the U-boat dodges the first salvo, it runs right into the firing solution of the second ship, and if it somehow evades that, the third ship is waiting. It's like a deadly game of 3-dimensional chess, played at high speed in the dark ocean depths. The U-boat commander has to outthink multiple opponents simultaneously while blind, running on limited battery power, and knowing that a single mistake means death for his entire crew. This coordinated Hedgehog tactic, which Allied sailors nicknamed the Hammer and Anvil, proves devastatingly effective in the final years of the Battle of the Atlantic. U-boats that might have escaped a single attacker find themselves trapped in a closing net of Hedgehog-equipped ships. German submarine tactics evolve in response, but the fundamental problem remains unsolvable. The Allies have achieved a technological and tactical superiority that can't be overcome. U-boats are forced to operate ever more cautiously, which reduces their effectiveness as commerce raiders, which is exactly what the Allies need. By the time Germany surrenders in May 1945, the Hedgehog has been credited with sinking or assisting in the sinking of over 50 German and Italian submarines. That might not sound like a huge number when you consider that the Allies sank over 700 U-boats during the entire war, but remember, Hedgehogs were only installed on a portion of escort vessels, and primarily in the latter half of the war. The weapon's impact per ship equipped was enormous. More importantly, the Hedgehog's psychological and strategic impact exceeded its raw kill count. The mere presence of Hedgehog-equipped ships forced U-boats to operate more conservatively, reducing their effectiveness as attackers. German submarine commanders never knew which Allied escorts had Hedgehogs and which didn't, so they had to assume every destroyer might have this terrifying weapon. This uncertainty changed their tactics, making them more defensive and less aggressive. But here's where our story takes a fascinating turn, because the impact of the Hedgehog didn't end with World War II. After the war, as tensions between the Soviet Union and the West escalate into the Cold War, anti-submarine warfare remains a critical military capability. The Soviet Navy is building submarines at an alarming rate, many of them based on captured German U-boat technology. The North Atlantic, which briefly became peaceful after 1945, once again becomes a strategic battleground where NATO and Soviet forces eye each other warily. The Hedgehog continues in service throughout the Cold War. British, American, Canadian, and other NATO navies retain the weapon and continue to develop improved versions. The basic concept proves so sound that it influences an entire generation of anti-submarine weapons. More advanced systems emerge. The American ASROC, which launches homing torpedoes instead of simple contact projectiles. The Australian Ikara. The Soviet RBU series of rocket launchers, which are essentially their own version of the Hedgehog concept. All of these weapons trace their lineage back to that simple idea Stuart Neville had in 1940. Throw the explosives ahead of the ship in a pattern that gives the submarine nowhere to hide. Modern anti-submarine warfare has evolved far beyond the Hedgehog. Today's systems use guided missiles, sophisticated sonar arrays, computer targeting, and autonomous underwater vehicles. But the fundamental tactical principles established by the Hedgehog remain relevant. Create a kill zone, maintain contact with the target, force the submarine into a position where evasion is impossible. Naval historians consider the Hedgehog one of the most important tactical innovations of World War II, ranking alongside radar, sonar, and the breaking of German naval codes as factors that turned the tide in the Battle of the Atlantic. Yet outside of military circles and serious World War II history enthusiasts, the Hedgehog remains relatively unknown. It doesn't have the dramatic appeal of radar or the mystique of code breaking. It's just a weapon system, a collection of mortars and projectiles, nothing that captures the popular imagination. But that's exactly what makes this story so compelling, because the Hedgehog represents something profound about warfare, innovation, and human ingenuity under pressure. Think about the context again. Britain in 1940 is on the ropes, being strangled by U-boats, facing potential starvation and defeat. The nation's best scientists and engineers are working on radar, on jet engines, on code-breaking machines, on atomic weapons research. These are the sexy, high-tech projects that get resources and attention. And in the middle of all this, a relatively junior naval officer has a simple idea about throwing explosives in a circle instead of a line. There's no advanced physics involved, no breakthrough in materials science, no revolutionary new theory, just a different pattern of deployment for existing technology. But that simple idea, properly implemented, saves thousands of lives and helps win the Battle of the Atlantic. There's a lesson here about innovation that applies far beyond military history. Sometimes the most effective solutions aren't the most complicated ones. Sometimes you don't need to invent entirely new technology. Sometimes you just need to use existing technology in a smarter way. The lessons from the Hedgehog story extend into business, technology, engineering, even everyday problem-solving. How many times have we seen companies throw massive resources at developing complex solutions when a simpler approach would work just as well? How often do we overcomplicate problems that could be solved with elegant simplicity? Steve Jobs famously said that innovation is saying no to 1,000 things. The Hedgehog is the opposite side of that same coin. Innovation is also saying yes to the right, simple thing at the right time. Consider what didn't change with the Hedgehog. The ships stayed the same. The sonar stayed the same. The tactics of convoy escort stayed largely the same. Even the explosives stayed the same. What changed was the deployment pattern and the fuse mechanism, 2 variables out of hundreds. But those 2 variables transformed the entire anti-submarine warfare equation. This is what engineers call an elegant solution. Minimum complexity, maximum impact. It's the kind of design that makes you slap your forehead and say, "Why didn't we think of this sooner?" But here's the thing. Somebody had to think of it. Innovation doesn't happen automatically. It requires someone to look at a problem from a fresh angle, someone willing to question the established way of doing things, someone brave enough to propose an idea that might get laughed at. Stuart Neville could have kept quiet. He was a junior officer Who was he to question the Royal Navy's established anti-submarine doctrine? The experts had been using depth charges for decades. What could he possibly know that they didn't? But he spoke up anyway. He proposed his idea. He pushed for testing. He persisted through skepticism and bureaucratic resistance. And because he did, thousands of lives were saved. There's another angle to this story that's worth exploring: the role of desperation in driving innovation. Would the Royal Navy have adopted the Hedgehog if Britain hadn't been facing potential starvation and defeat? Probably not. In peacetime, or even in a less desperate war situation, the institutional resistance would have been insurmountable. The Hedgehog would have been filed away as an interesting idea to study further, maybe implement in 5 or 10 years after extensive testing and evaluation. But in 1941, Britain doesn't have 5 or 10 years. It has months, maybe weeks, before the U-boat blockade becomes unsustainable. That desperation cuts through the bureaucracy like a knife through butter. Ideas that would normally take years to implement get fast-tracked. Risks that would normally be unacceptable become necessary gambles. This pattern repeats throughout history. Penicillin gets rushed into mass production during World War II because wounded soldiers are dying from infected wounds. The Manhattan Project compresses decades of atomic research into 3 years because of the fear that Germany might build a nuclear weapon first. The Apollo program puts men on the moon in less than a decade because of Cold War competition with the Soviet Union. Crisis accelerates innovation, not always in good ways, of course. Desperation can also lead to waste, to bad decisions, to cutting corners that shouldn't be cut. But sometimes, when you're forced to move fast and take risks, you discover that the careful, conservative approach you were taking before wasn't actually necessary. The Hedgehog proves that you can develop, test, deploy, and operationalize a revolutionary weapon system in less than 2 years when the stakes are high enough. In peacetime, the same project might take a decade or more, bogged down in committees and studies and trials. There's a question worth asking: how much potential innovation are we leaving on the table because we're not desperate enough? How many simple, elegant solutions exist right now, waiting for someone to notice them, but won't be implemented because the pressure isn't high enough? Let me tell you about one more engagement that really drives home the human dimension of this story. In April 1945, just weeks before Germany's surrender, the frigate HMS Loch Killen is on patrol in the North Sea. The war is clearly winding down. Everyone knows Germany has lost. U-boat operations have been drastically reduced. Most of the remaining submarines are either in port or heading there to surrender. But some U-boats are still at sea, still hunting, still fighting. Their commanders know the war is lost, but they're following orders, or they're too proud to give up, or they're just trying to get their crews home alive. Loch Killen's sonar picks up a contact. It's U-boat's U-1065, a Type 7 submarine on what will turn out to be its final patrol. The submarine has been at sea for 6 weeks, has survived multiple depth charge attacks, and is trying to make it back to Norway. The Loch Killen's captain, Lieutenant Commander T.R. Galley, doesn't hesitate. War's not over until it's over. He positions his ship for a Hedgehog attack. But here's where the story gets interesting. Galley is an experienced anti-submarine commander. He's sunk U-boats before, but he's also a thinking officer, someone who's been paying attention to how the war has evolved. He knows that many U-boat crews are demoralized, that some are looking for ways to surrender rather than fight to the death. So before he fires the Hedgehog, he tries something unusual. He transmits on the emergency frequency in English and German, ordering the submarine to surface and surrender. He gives them 2 minutes to comply. The sonar contact doesn't move. The submarine stays submerged. Galley gives the order to fire. The Hedgehog launches. 24 projectiles splash into the water. Multiple explosions. Direct hits. U-1065 is mortally wounded. But the submarine doesn't sink immediately. The captain, Kapitänleutnant Ludwig Freiwald, manages to blow the ballast tanks. The crippled submarine breaks the surface, listing heavily, water pouring into the damaged hull through multiple breaches. The crew begins abandoning ship. They're young men, most of them teenagers. They've been at sea for weeks, eating mouldy bread and breathing recycled air. They're exhausted, terrified, and suddenly very grateful to be alive. Loch Killin's crew watches as the German sailors jump into the freezing North Sea. Some are wearing life jackets, some aren't. Some can swim, some can't. And here's the thing that often gets forgotten in war stories. The men on Loch Killin immediately begin rescue operations. They throw life rings, launch boats, pull German sailors from the water. These are the same men who, 30 seconds ago, were trying to kill these Germans. Now they're saving their lives. 23 German sailors are rescued. 26 go down with the submarine. Among those saved is Kapitän-Leutnant Freiwald, who will spend the last few weeks of the war as a prisoner before being repatriated to Germany. Continue when ready. Retry a continue years later. In a memoir published in 1968, Freiwald writes about that day. He describes the terror of the Hedgehog attack, the explosions that tore through his submarine's hull, the desperate struggle to surface before the ocean crushed them. But he also writes about the British sailors who pulled him from the water, who gave him dry clothes and hot tea, who treated his wounded crew with the same care they'd give their own men. He writes, "We were enemies for 6 years, but in the end we were just sailors. They understood what we had endured, and when the fighting stopped, the humanity returned." This is what the Hedgehog ultimately represents. Not just a weapon, not just a tactical innovation, but a tool that helped end the war faster. And ending the war faster meant less suffering for everyone involved. Fewer merchant sailors drowning in the Atlantic, fewer U-boat crews dying in crushed submarines, fewer cities being bombed, fewer families receiving death telegrams. The mathematics of war are brutal, but sometimes the most humanitarian thing you can do is win quickly and decisively. The Hedgehog helped make that possible. Now, let's talk about the legacy and what happened to the key people in this story. Stuart Neville, the man whose idea started it all, continued serving in the Royal Navy throughout the war. He was promoted to commander and later to captain. After the war, he remained in the Navy until his retirement in the 1962nd. He received recognition for his contribution to anti-submarine warfare, though he never became a household name. He died in 1972, largely unknown outside naval circles. It's worth noting that Neville never claimed sole credit for the Hedgehog. In interviews and correspondence, he always emphasized the team effort involved in developing and refining the weapon. He praised the engineers who solved the technical challenges, the sailors who tested and operated the system, and the commanders who had the courage to adopt new tactics. This is another important lesson from the story. Innovation is rarely the work of a single genius. It's a collaborative process. Neville had the initial idea, but it took hundreds of people to turn that idea into reality. Engineers designed the firing mechanisms. Metallurgists developed the fuses. Factory workers manufactured the components. Sailors learned to use the weapon effectively. Commanders integrated it into their tactical doctrine. Every innovation is built on the work of countless others. The Hedgehog itself continued in service for decades. The last Hedgehogs weren't retired from active service until the 1992nd, a remarkable 50-year service life for a weapon system. Some were still being used by smaller navies well into the 2000s, though by then they were thoroughly obsolete compared to modern guided torpedoes and anti-submarine missiles. Today, you can see Hedgehog systems in maritime museums around the world. There's one at the Imperial War Museum in London. The National Museum of the Royal Navy in Portsmouth has one. The U.S. Navy Museum in Washington, D.C. has an American-built version. They sit quietly in exhibit halls, strange-looking collections of tubes and projectiles, their significance understood by few visitors who pass by. But those rusted weapons represent something profound. They represent the power of simple ideas, properly executed. They represent the importance of being willing to challenge established doctrine. They represent the collaboration between inventors, engineers, and operators. They represent the difference that individual initiative can make, even in the largest and most bureaucratic organizations. The Battle of the Atlantic was the longest continuous military campaign of World War II, lasting from 1939 to 1945. Over 72,000 Allied sailors and merchant seamen died in those cold waters. Over 30,000 German submariners died, the highest casualty rate of any branch of any military in the entire war. Over 3,500 merchant ships were sunk. 75 Allied warships were lost. The human cost was staggering, but it would have been even worse without innovations like the Hedgehog. There's a memorial in Liverpool, England, at the pierhead overlooking the River Mersey. It's dedicated to the merchant sailors who died in the Battle of the Atlantic. Thousands of names are inscribed on the stone walls. Men from dozens of countries, of all ages, who volunteered or were conscripted to sail through submarine-infested waters carrying the supplies that kept Britain alive. Many of those men died because a U-boat found their convoy before an escort could find the U-boat. But many others survived because somewhere nearby, a destroyer or corvette equipped with a Hedgehog was hunting, protecting, ensuring the submarines couldn't operate with impunity. We don't know how many lives the Hedgehog saved. It's impossible to calculate. For every U-boat sunk, how many merchant ships were spared? For every convoy that made it safely across the Atlantic, how many sailors lived to see their families again? The numbers disappear into statistical uncertainty, but we know the direction of the effect. The Hedgehog made Allied escorts more effective. More effective escorts meant fewer successful U-boat attacks. Fewer successful attacks meant more supplies reaching Britain and the Soviet Union. More supplies meant the Allied nations could continue fighting. Continuing to fight meant eventually winning the war. It's a chain of causation that runs from a simple idea about circular firing patterns all the way to the end of Nazi Germany. Let me address something that might be on your mind. Was the Hedgehog really that important, or am I exaggerating its significance? It's a fair question. World War II was won by many factors: industrial production, code breaking, radar, superior numbers, strategic bombing, the Eastern Front. The list goes on. No single weapon or innovation won the war, but the Battle of the Atlantic was critical. Churchill himself said so. If the Allies had lost the Atlantic, Britain would have been forced to negotiate a peace settlement. The Soviet Union would have received far fewer supplies via the Arctic convoys. The build-up of American forces in Britain for the eventual invasion of Europe would have been impossible. The entire course of the war would have changed. And the Hedgehog was one of several key innovations that turned the tide in the Atlantic. Not the only one, but an important one. The historical record is clear on this point. Ships equipped with Hedgehogs were significantly more effective at sinking submarines than ships without them. The weapon worked exactly as designed and provided a real tactical advantage. So yes, the Hedgehog really was that important. Not as important as, say, radar or breaking the Enigma code, but important enough to deserve recognition and study. There's one more aspect of this story I want to explore. What happened to anti-submarine warfare after the Hedgehog proved successful? The Cold War brought new challenges. Soviet submarines were more advanced than German U-boats, with better sonar, faster speeds, and nuclear propulsion. The Hedgehog alone wasn't enough to counter these threats. But the principles behind the Hedgehog influenced everything that came after. The idea of a head-throwing weapons became standard in anti-submarine warfare. The concept of creating a three-dimensional kill zone around the target's probable location remained central to tactical thinking. The importance of maintaining sonar contact throughout the attack became doctrine. Modern anti-submarine weapons like the ASROC, the Malafon, and the Subroc all trace their conceptual lineage to the Hedgehog. They're vastly more sophisticated, using guided missiles and homing torpedoes instead of simple contact projectiles. But the underlying tactical concept is the same. Position ahead of the submarine and create a situation where evasion is impossible. Even today, in an era of computer-guided weapons and satellite surveillance, the lessons of the Hedgehog remain relevant. Simplicity is valuable. Direct application of force is often more effective than indirect approaches. Maintaining contact with your target is crucial. Creating situations where the enemy has no good options is the essence of successful tactics. These principles apply far beyond naval warfare. Business strategy, diplomatic negotiations, sports, games, even personal relationships all involve similar dynamics. Put your opponent in a position where all their options are bad options. Force them to react to your initiative rather than acting on their own. Maintain pressure that doesn't let up. The Hedgehog is a case study in applied tactical thinking. Let me bring this story to a close by circling back to where we started, the power of simple innovation in desperate times. The Hedgehog wasn't the most glamorous weapon of World War II. It didn't have the destructive spectacle of a battleship's main guns or the dramatic appeal of a fighter plane dogfight. It didn't involve cutting-edge science like radar or atomic weapons. It was just a collection of mortars that threw small bombs in a circle. But that simplicity was its strength. In 1940, when Britain faced its darkest hour, the nation didn't need another wonder weapon that would take years to develop and deploy. It needed practical solutions that could be implemented quickly with existing technology and industrial capacity. The Hedgehog fit that requirement perfectly. The weapon could be manufactured in existing factories using readily available materials. It could be installed on ships without major modifications. Crews could be trained to use it in a matter of days rather than months. And most importantly, it worked. It worked immediately, it worked reliably, and it worked better than anyone had expected. This is what makes the Hedgehog story so compelling and so relevant today. We live in an era that's obsessed with disruption, with revolutionary breakthroughs, with paradigm-shifting innovations. We celebrate the moonshots, the 10x improvements, the technologies that change everything. But sometimes what we really need isn't a revolution. Sometimes we need evolution. Sometimes the best solution isn't to tear everything down and start over, but to take what we have and use it better. Think about the problems we face today: climate change, global pandemics, economic inequality, political polarization. These are massive, complex challenges that seem to demand equally massive and complex solutions. And yes, we do need big innovations. We need breakthrough technologies in renewable energy, in medicine, in agriculture, in 100 different fields. But we also need hedgehog thinking. We need people who can look at existing tools and resources and say, what if we just used these differently? What if we changed one or two variables instead of everything? The Hedgehog teaches us that incremental innovation, properly applied, can be just as transformative as revolutionary breakthroughs, maybe more so, because incremental innovations can be implemented faster and with fewer resources. Consider modern parallels. The shipping container, invented in the 1950 seconds, didn't revolutionize transportation technology. Ships, trucks, and trains already existed. But by standardizing how cargo was packed and moved, containers transformed global trade and created the modern interconnected economy. Simple idea, massive impact. Or look at the polio vaccine. Jonas Salk didn't invent a completely new type of medicine. He used existing virology techniques and existing manufacturing processes. But by applying those techniques systematically and at scale, he eliminated a disease that had terrorized parents for generations. Or consider the Green Revolution in agriculture. Norman Borlaug didn't create genetic engineering or invent farming. He developed new varieties of wheat using traditional breeding techniques, combined with better fertilization and irrigation practices. Simple improvements to existing methods. Result? Hundreds of millions of people saved from starvation. These are all Hedgehog-style innovations. Take what exists, make it better, deploy it widely, save lives. The lesson here isn't that complexity is bad or that revolutionary innovations aren't valuable. They absolutely are. But we shouldn't overlook the potential of simple, practical improvements to solve urgent problems. Stuart Neville wasn't trying to reinvent naval warfare. He was just trying to solve a specific problem: how to hit a submarine that keeps dodging your depth charges. His solution was elegant in its simplicity. Change the pattern, change the fuse, that's it. But those two changes, properly implemented, helped turn the tide of the most important naval campaign of the 20th century. There's something deeply satisfying about that. In a war dominated by increasingly complex technology, where scientists were splitting atoms and engineers were building jet engines, one of the most effective weapons was also one of the simplest. It reminds us that intelligence isn't just about understanding complex things. It's also about seeing simple solutions that others have overlooked. It's about having the clarity of thought to cut through complexity and identify the core problem, and then having the courage to propose a solution that might seem almost too simple to work. How many problems in your life, in your work, in your community could be solved with hedgehog thinking? How many situations are you overcomplicating when a simpler approach would actually be more effective? These are questions worth asking. Let me leave you with one final thought about the men who operated these weapons. When you visit those maritime museums and see the Hedgehog launchers on display, it's easy to view them as museum pieces, artifacts from a bygone era, cold metal objects behind velvet ropes, interesting mainly to historians and military enthusiasts. But every one of those weapons was operated by real people. Young men, most of them, barely out of school, standing on the pitching decks of destroyers in the middle of the North Atlantic, doing one of the most dangerous jobs in the most dangerous campaign of the most destructive war in human history. They were terrified. Of course they were. Who wouldn't be? They knew that somewhere beneath the dark waters, a U-boat might be lining up a torpedo shot. They knew their ship could be hit at any moment, could sink in minutes, could leave them flailing in freezing water, waiting for a rescue that might never come. But they stood their posts anyway. They did their jobs. When the sonar operator called out, "Contact!" they ran to their stations. When the order came to fire, they pressed the buttons, pulled the levers, launched the projectiles. They did what needed to be done. And many of them survived the war because they had a weapon that worked. A simple weapon, an effective weapon, a hedgehog. The story of the hedgehog is ultimately a human story. It's about a naval officer who had an idea and fought to make it real. It's about engineers who solved difficult technical problems under impossible deadlines. It's about factory workers who manufactured the components. It's about sailors who learned to use a new weapon and used it effectively. It's about commanders who were willing to change tactics in the middle of a desperate battle. All of these people, working together, turned a simple idea into a weapon that helped win the Battle of the Atlantic. Not because the weapon was magical or perfect, but because it was good enough, deployed widely enough, and used skillfully enough to make a real difference. That's the lesson. That's what we should remember. Innovation doesn't have to be revolutionary to be transformative. Solutions don't have to be complex to be effective. And individuals, even relatively junior ones, can make contributions that change the course of history if they're willing to speak up, persist through skepticism, and fight for their ideas. The next time you face a difficult problem, remember the hedgehog. Don't automatically assume you need a revolutionary new approach. Sometimes the best solution is simpler than you think. Sometimes you just need to take what you have and use it better. Change the pattern. Change the fuse. Create a situation where your opponent has nowhere to go. Simple ideas, massive impact. That's the power of the hedgehog, and that's a lesson that will remain relevant as long as humans face challenges that need solving. The rusted mortars in those museum displays may be obsolete as weapons, but as symbols of human ingenuity, persistence, and the power of simple elegance, they'll never grow old. Remember their story, remember what they represent, and remember that sometimes the best solution to a complex problem is simpler than anyone expects. You just have to be brave enough to see it, and persistent enough to make it real.